Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. My name is Amber Elias, and joining this News Focus episode is America's defense reporter, Ryan Finnerty. Ryan, welcome to this episode.
Good to be with you, Amber.
Let's take a look at the top aviation stories this week on FlightGlobal. The UK competition regulators have cleared Boeing's acquisition of Spirit AeroSystems after concluding that the sale of parts of the aerostructures supplier's operations to Airbus would prevent any market distortion from taking place. United Aircraft recently filed a detailed patent for a wide-body twin-jet family. Illustrations accompanying the proposal show a design strongly resembling the Boeing 787, but also feature wingtips similar to those on the A350. China's long-anticipated military parade to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War offered glimpses of possible new aircraft, but produced no major surprises. China did unveil new support aircraft, but not the long-rumored H-20 stealth bomber, which still failed to make an appearance. Ryan, what did the parade tell us about developments for China's fleet?
Well, from what we saw, Amber, it really still appears like China is chasing the U.S. and trying to replicate many of the platforms that are already fielded by the U.S. Air Force and Navy and their allies in the region. We did see some new additions to the People's Liberation Army fleet, as you mentioned, namely an anti-submarine warfare aircraft and an electronic warfare platform, which are both based on China's Y-9 transport. The Y-9FQ is a maritime patrol and submarine hunting aircraft that is along the lines of the U.S. Navy's P-8 Poseidon, made by Boeing. And China's Y-9LG is an electronic warfare variant that seems to be modeled on the U.S. Air Force's EA-37B Compass Call. That is an aircraft that could be used to suppress the effectiveness of radars, disrupt navigation systems, and jam communications. But really, we didn't see anything game-changing. The U.S. military and its regional allies in the Indo-Pacific already expect to face that type of opposition in a conflict. So nothing that was seen really changes the balance of power. There were also a few uncrewed jets featured in the parade, although none of them actually flew. As our defense editor Greg Waldron pointed out in his coverage of the parade this week, the models on display were likely just mock-ups, and they were carried through Tiananmen Square on the backs of trucks. We can kind of assume that these are similar in nature to the autonomous fighters being developed by multiple U.S. defense companies, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. We don't really know the full capabilities of the jets that were shown in the parade, but they have a similar appearance to the designs being worked on in the U.S., which we know to be primarily focused on providing support to air superiority missions for the U.S. Air Force. So we can assume that, like some of its other attempts, China is trying to replicate what the U.S. is doing. And China does have a lot of experience developing and fielding uncrewed military aircraft over the last few years, and we've seen evidence of advanced prototype aircraft flying over China throughout this past year. So I think it's safe to assume the Chinese will have uncrewed tactical jets flying in the near future, if they don't already, even if those weren't on display in a big public event like this parade. What we didn't see, as you mentioned, were the new H-20 stealth bomber or any of the mysterious new prototype fighters that have been documented flying over China throughout the past year. Haven't been given official names to the public, but at least one of them is known as the J-36 to China observers. We don't really know exactly what role these play within the military ecosystem or order of battle. And so that was something we had been looking for, but didn't see during the parade. We also didn't see any evidence of a successful launch from China's newest aircraft carrier, the CNS Fujian, which is another example of Beijing attempting to replicate the military capabilities of its rival, the U.S., in building out this fleet of big aircraft carriers.
The long-anticipated H-20 stealth bomber, which is seen by many as an answer to the US Air Force's Northrop Grumman's B-2s and developmental B-21s, is still anticipated. What do we actually know about this aircraft?
Yeah, very little, unfortunately. As you said, it's believed to be an attempt at replicating both the long range and low observable stealth attributes of the Northrop Grumman B-2, which has been in active service with the U.S. Air Force since the late 90s. And despite being one of the first stealth aircraft ever fielded, the B-2 recently proved how effective it still is, even decades after it was designed. The famous flying wing bomber played the central role, really, in the U.S. strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities in June. A flight of those bombers launched from the continental U.S. and flew nonstop round trip to Iran to drop bunker busting munitions on a uranium enrichment site, and then back to the U.S. in one single marathon trip. And that really demonstrates the long-range strike capability that the U.S. has, both to hit targets very far away, to refuel aircraft in flight, because a flight that long requires in-flight tanking, and to penetrate at least some form of modern air defense. It's kind of up for debate how much of Iran's air defenses were still intact at the time that strike took place, but there were no U.S. losses suffered. So it really shows the capability of the B-2 and the accompanying stealth fighters. And China knows that it could face those type of deep penetration bomber strikes if there were to be a conflict in the Western Pacific. And Beijing is likely looking for an answer to that threat with the H-20. And the reason they're doing that is because the PLA's current long-range bomber is non-stealthy, the H-6, which is based on an old Soviet design from the Cold War, the Tu-16, made by Tupolev in Russia. And even the Russians don't fly that anymore. They have a modern, upgraded version. So while China's bombers have been updated over the years, they're still non-stealthy, and they would likely be extremely vulnerable to detection by Allied airspace observation radars and then interception by either fighters or ground-based air defenses. The H-20 is seen as a potential remedy to that situation, but it's really totally unknown at this point how effective it would be. U.S. defense officials, speaking on background, have previously claimed that it would be vastly inferior to the new B-21, which is currently being developed by Northrop Grumman as a successor to the B-2. And the Pentagon says the B-21 is going to be even more capable than the B-2. They're also hoping to field quite a bit more, at least 5 times more. There's only around 20 B-2s in service now, and the Air Force wants to buy at least 100 B-21s. So an increase in both individual capability, but also total capacity for the fleet. But even that aircraft, the B-21, its capabilities are a closely held secret. So we really don't have much to go on for either the US or the Chinese aircraft.
Several other world leaders joined Chinese Premier Xi Jinping for the parade in Beijing, including the leaders of Russia and North Korea. It was widely viewed as a show of strength and of alliances between these countries, and also an intimidation attempt for the US. How has the US responded?
Yeah, there's been very little response from Washington, to be frank. Ahead of the parade the day before, the top U.S. Air Force officer in the Pacific was asked about the upcoming parade at that time, and he said that big military parades are kind of viewed as an attempt by national governments at deterring their geopolitical rivals, and he pointedly said that the U.S. would not be deterred by anything it saw in the parade in Beijing. And I would say that's likely to be true based on what we observed. There was nothing that, would make planners at the Pentagon or political leaders in Washington rethink the current posture. U.S. President Donald Trump did acknowledge the meeting of the 3 leaders in his preferred way, a post on Truth Social. Trump wished Xi and the Chinese people a good celebration, while also noting that, quote, a massive amount of support and blood was given to China by the U.S. during World War II to help repel the Japanese invasion. And he also spoke directly to his counterparts saying, quote, "Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America," end quote. So Trump did acknowledge the presence of his Russian and North Korean counterparts, but nothing really in the way of a substantial response from Washington.
A 2024 Pentagon report described China's People's Liberation Army Air Force as quickly approaching US standards in critical areas such as the production and fielding of unmanned aerial systems. Would you agree based on what we saw in the parade?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to roll some uncrewed jets through Tiananmen Square on the back of a truck, but it's something else entirely to actually build one that works and then deploy them effectively in large numbers. And that report and that quote was specifically mentioning uncrewed aircraft. And it's an old truism of military conflict that you never know how your troops, your officers, and equipment are going to perform until they're sent into action. And China hasn't fought a war in decades. So even as it's fielding a rapidly modernized military force, its personnel have little in the way of actual experience. And that is a stark difference between China and the US military. China is also weak in some very key areas of air warfare, like in-flight refueling and stealth bombers, as you mentioned earlier. It also has far fewer aircraft carriers than the US, and nothing we saw in the parade changes that. I do think it's interesting that China appears to be trying to replicate the US military's capability, because those two forces aren't necessarily trying to solve the same problem, and you kind of build a force around what you're trying to accomplish. The US, for example, has to project power across two oceans to Asia and Europe, maintaining this massive logistics capability to deliver troops, aircraft, weapons, and supplies from its industrial hubs in North America. That's one of the reasons the US military and the US Navy focus so much on aircraft carriers, is because they allow you to project power like that. China is not necessarily interested in projecting power across the globe. It wants to be more of a regional hegemon, with maybe the short to medium term goal of retaking Taiwan, whether politically or militarily. Whether you would structure your force similarly is maybe a matter for debate. China does have several advantages, particularly a very strong edge in shipbuilding capacity compared to the US. And China was also a leader in kind of developing this concept of using mass stockpiles of long-range precision missiles to offset a technologically superior adversary. And that's why you always hear this debate about, are aircraft carriers relevant if they're facing an enemy with huge numbers of guided missiles that can either sink them or force them to stay far away from coastlines where they're less effective. And so China has some disadvantages, but it's sought to maybe offset those weaknesses with other areas, and particularly a focus on just industrial strength output of critical munitions and assets like ships. And everyone in the US and Europe is kind of slowly returning to this 20th century realization that a lot of success in large scale war comes down to sheer industrial might, the ability to produce large amounts of equipment and get it to where it needs to go. And that was an insight that had largely fallen by the wayside in the West since the end of the Cold War. China internalized that lesson and has structured its kind of military industrial base around that. That's not necessarily something that can be easily depicted in a parade. So I think some of China's biggest strengths are not necessarily visible from this recent event.
Yeah, very interesting, considering how the US is absolutely much more focused on uncrewed aircraft and developing that. And we've seen the General Atomics Aeronautical Systems have just recently completed the first flight of its new uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft prototype, which is obviously a big step forward for the military in the US. But how far away are we from actually having an uncrewed aircraft from being operational?
Yeah, I mean, we should note that this program really arose out of a perceived weakness against China's strengths. China really pioneered this idea in the modern era of fielding large fleets of uncrewed aircraft, of large stockpiles of guided missiles, and using that to hold the U.S. and its allies at risk, which, the U.S. doctrine is sort of built around smaller fleets of highly capable ships and aircraft that can't be replaced very quickly. So the U.S. Air Force recognized this weakness and started the Collaborative Combat Aircraft program, which was meant to deploy maybe a more modestly capable fighter jet that could operate without a pilot and could be produced in larger quantities on an annual basis at a lower cost than something like an F-35 or an F-15EX. And we're now getting towards the end of the first stage of that program, what they call Increment 1. There's 2 designs that have been selected, one from General Atomics and one from Anduril Industries. They're both about to begin flight testing. General Atomics got to that mark just a little bit sooner, starting flight test operations with their YFQ-42A, which is the Air Force designated name for that prototype. Anduril is expected to be close behind. At the time we're recording this, they haven't yet flown their YFQ-44A, but it's expected to happen in the immediate future. Anduril actually started ground testing before General Atomics with their design, so the two are neck and neck. The Air Force has said that it hopes to conclude flight trials and make a competitive procurement decision before the end of fiscal year 2026, which actually ends in next September. So within the next 12 months, we expect to see a decision on which of these 2 aircraft the U.S. Air Force is going to purchase. And then both companies say that they can ramp up production relatively quickly. These designs were sort of built to be easy to produce at large scale, which is something that is not really true for most modern military aircraft. They have relatively low output numbers. So the goal for the U.S. Air Force is to have a large number of these in service, in the hundreds probably, by sometime in the early 2030s. We don't know which one it will be yet. That will, again, be a decision that we likely see next year in 2026. But it should be noted that both of these designs are going to be available for international customers. It's not being restricted to just the US. There may be some differences between what's available overseas and what's included in the US aircraft, but both companies, Anduril and General Atomics, have told me that they're seeing a lot of interest in Europe in particular, and they're working on deals with European manufacturers to produce these aircraft locally, if that's something that European customers want to prioritize. So it's very likely that we'll see them flying for both the U.S. Air Force and some of the U.S. allies elsewhere around the world in the pretty near future, the medium term, I would say. Boeing is also relatively far along in a development program with the MQ-28, which was passed over for the Air Force program, but is kind of the national champion of Australia. It was developed in partnership between Boeing and the Royal Australian Air Force. That's got actually more flying time than any of the other designs, although they don't have a firm production contract yet. So that's another one that's potentially in the mix. So there are quite a few answers from the Western world, predominantly the US at the moment, to what's going on in China. And, we're likely in the early stages of what appears to be kind of a new arms race to really build out big fleets of these small, affordable, uncrewed, and notably autonomous fighter aircraft that can operate with some input from a human pilot, either on the ground or in another plane, but with no human in the cockpit, and can fly and land themselves, take off and land. The U.S. Navy has one also being designed by Boeing that will launch from an aircraft carrier and do aerial refueling that we expect to be flying next year. So this really does look to be the future of aerial warfare for the major industrial powers around the world.
No, absolutely. So it sounds like China's parade, although looks very impressive, wonderful photo opportunities for world leaders, actually didn't present the details that we were expecting and that they had the opportunity to present in terms of new technology, new aircraft, and even more information on things that had been effectively leaked by the government sort of at the end of last year, and that we'd seen snippets of before. Nothing that they'd really confirmed.
Yeah, and that kind of makes sense if you think about it. No government is going to be showing off its secret development projects before they're ready to be unveiled, both for potential embarrassment if something doesn't work or for a desire to keep things secret. I attended the public unveiling of the B-21 a few years ago in Palmdale, California, and it was a very tightly orchestrated event. The hangar wasn't opened until it was dark out, and that was an attempt to prevent any kind of unwanted surveillance, whether physical or low Earth orbit or aircraft, anything like that could be used to take a photo. And we were restricted from getting too close to the airplane. And, this is one of the U.S. military's biggest secretive development projects at the moment. So it kind of makes sense, I think, that China would maybe keep some of these projects at close hold. And as I said, that could be because they're not working yet and not ready to fly, or it could just be that they don't want the US and its allies to know exactly what it's working on. But I think as the technologies mature in the US and the Pentagon makes more of a public show of what it's developing and what it's fielding, we will likely see some kind of response from China to show, at least an unofficial response, showing that they're keeping pace and able to match their perceived rival.
Yeah, absolutely. And although the US haven't publicly made a big deal of the parade and what they saw there, I'm sure they privately kept notes and were watching things closer than they let on.
Yeah, they have open source analysts who are watching the parade, but they have much more advanced ways of making observations than we do. So I'm sure the Pentagon knows a lot more about the H-20 development effort and some of these other new aircraft that have been seen flying around than we do. And I think one thing it's worth noting that our defense editor, Greg Waldron, always points out is that, a lot of times this news sort of gets broken in either Chinese social media channels or in some of the government affiliated media outlets like the Global Times. And as Greg always points out, none of that information gets published without the Chinese government's approval. Unlike in the West, where government secrets are occasionally published on social media, either unintentionally or maliciously, that type of thing is less common in China. So if the Chinese Communist Party wants the world to know about something, they will find an avenue to reveal it. It just may not always be the same way that a Western government would reveal something.
Absolutely. They do love a leak on social media, don't they? They love a carefully orchestrated picture released with no context. But obviously, we all know that is official, even if they're not claiming it. Okay, Ryan, thank you so much for joining me on this week's episode of FlightGlobal Focus.
Good to be with you, Amber.
FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio production by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.